Oh, it's a completely different view from sat down here than it was over there. Lovely to see you all again. If any of you weren't in the morning session, my name is Becky Slack and I'm co-director of Agenda. And this morning's session was very much focused on the UK. And so now we're going to move to the international picture. We have, again, a fantastic panel, a few more people this time, so I'm going to keep our questions maybe to the minimum, if you can keep your responses quite brief so that we've got lots of time for questions from our audience. I don't know about all of you, but this morning was absolutely brilliant. My mind is fizzing with ideas, and I've had some really excellent conversations, and I'm really excited about the opportunity to take some of those forward. And one of them in particular, I had the privilege of attending Vera's session this morning on the excellent case study of her work at From Streets to Homes. But one of the things that really struck me and I was quite surprised about was the impact of populism and the challenges of operating under a populist government. And so for the benefit of those people who weren't in your session, can you just give us a bit of a flavour as to what life is like in Hungary when you work in housing and homelessness, please?
Yeah, okay. I will try to keep that short, really, because we had a whole half session dedicated to that. But I think with the internet era, we lost something important, and that is the research that it takes to know about the world and the energy it takes to develop new policies. And with all the social media and AI and technologies, now the populist power are just taking over all over the globe. And I think that in Western Europe and in all of the EU, people tend to think that we are just immune to that. We are strong democracies, we are clever enough, we are better than that, we're not going to fall for that. But we can clearly see that this is not the case. And when we think about the EU, then we have to also think about that almost a third of the EU countries are now post-transition countries that are not the most thriving economies. And in some cases, we are more fragile democracies as well. And so when we think about Hungary, the services you are criticizing, in some cases, our services we are actually still dream about. You have to see that. And so I'm sorry, I just took some notes to share all that with you. And so when we take all that to consideration, we can say, and we must say, that Europe is not safe from this rise of populism at all. And we see the risks in Hungary that already bear with us, with the populist government of 15 years, more than 1.5 decades, many people's all professional life, under an era that is just saying that, when we make suggestions on any policy level, it is framed as a political agenda against current governance, which is just not right. We are professional organizations, as all of you here, and our job is to make it better for all the people we are responsible for. And that's not political, that's just why we exist. And now that is at risk, I think, in Hungary, and in many other stances, I see that clearly.
And I think perhaps what people aren't necessarily familiar with is that you've also been affected by the cuts to USAID. I think quite often when we were talking about what Trump has done, we've thought about it as being having an impact on the global south. But actually, Europe has also been affected by that. Is that right?
Yeah, and that's the other part. So when I say that your services are services we are dreaming of, then it comes to USAID, because we don't consider Europe as a client of international aiding because we think that our countries have the services. But then again, that's not the case when it comes for the Ukrainian crisis, because obviously Ukraine is in Europe and it's neighboring by European Union countries, Eastern European Union countries. And the people who are fleeing from the Ukraine are coming to our countries, which countries are not having the policies, the power, the services to serve all these refugees. And then we have to seek for UN funding, and our operations in serving the Ukrainian refugees were mostly funded by UNHCR. And now when the Trump administration decided to cut on USAID funding, then it took away like 80% of financing in the operations of Ukrainian support. And that is a European issue because there are tens of thousands of people lost all the support they had in like 1 week's time. And so when I will have just one sentence from 3 CMs and then I'll finish. So my organization is small and we can't afford not to be in contact with clients, but not in the financial terms, but in the terms that when I'm here with you, I'm also representing our clients and I think about them. So for example, think about a client who can't go home to Ukraine because the house is not there anymore. Or I think about a client who flew with a 70-something-year-old mother, but the mother got a stroke in Hungary. They're not going to leave the country. They need to be supported there. Or I have to think about other clients and, for example, who started like Hungarian schools already. They shouldn't leave the country for not being funded there. So we have these people all around us. And it's just 3, but we are talking about tens of thousands of people right here in Europe. And if they are not with us, they will be with you, so they're not going to disappear anyways.
Thank you. Freek, Spineejwin, Director of FEANTSA, we've just had a sort of local perspective on Europe. Maybe you could give us the kind of broader European perspective. And in particular, in preparation for this, I was looking at your latest report, where you talk about how Europe seems to have woken up to the seriousness of the housing crisis. Maybe you might also expand a little bit on that.
Yes. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. That question I get very often, and the caveat before I answer is that there is 27 member states in the European Union, and they all have their own dynamics. But in general terms, I think if you look at the numbers, the homeless numbers, the picture is bleak, and there's no way around it. We estimate that there is about 1.3 million people that are on any given day in a shelter or on the street in the European Union. And that number has tripled in the last 15 to 20 years. So there is something happening at the bottom end of society which is really, really concerning. And we see no end to the increase in quite a number of countries. And that's just sheltered and unsheltered people. So we discount sofa surfers, etc., etc. So the issue is much bigger. I think in terms of policy, the picture is more nuanced. There is progress. I think that for the European Union as a whole, that you can say that we have never housed so many homeless people now. But we struggle to stop the inflow into the homeless system. Housing First has taken off in quite a number of countries, often as an experiment still. In some countries is being scaled. That's things to be happy and hopeful about. But it happens in a context of growing homelessness. And I think we have to be very careful, more sophisticated in the way we do advocacy work. I think we have to find a way to welcome policy progress in a dire context of rising numbers. If we use the rising numbers as the only or main indicator of the impact of policies, we might scare policymakers away from engaging in the fight against homelessness. So I think we'll have to be a little bit more careful in that space. What is very concerning in terms of policy is the migration and the migration policies and how they are changing, becoming more harsh, more strict. Actually, often a violation of human rights. I share the concerns that Leilani had and the hope, but I sometimes have the impression that when it concerns asylum seekers and undocumented migrants, that the rule of law is dead in the European Union. And it creates quite a bit of desperation. I don't know what is possible anymore. In my country, for instance, the Minister of Migration publicly says that she doesn't want to provide accommodation shelter to single male asylum seekers. That's against the law. It's against EU law, it's against Belgian law. She has been convicted more than 10,000 times. But the policy stays in place. So I'm really worried about the whole migration discourse. I think we also have to not be blind to the fact that the increase we see of the homeless numbers over the last couple of years is largely related to the flaws in the migration policies. But that said, there is reason to be hopeful. There are some countries where the numbers go down and the policy is good. Finland has been cited as a country already, even if numbers go slightly up again, which is interesting because it is obviously related to the fact that in Finland, the government has slashed housing benefits and disinvested in social housing. That you cannot do without seeing the effects in the homeless area, and that's what we see at the moment. But it still remains a country with fascinating results. Denmark, often silent about their success, but worth looking at. Austria, same, silent about the results, but quite impactful what they do there. So I think overall the picture is quite dire, some policy progress, and certainly some countries to look at to get some hope.
Thank you. Mark, so Mark Robinson, Director of International Programmes at DePaul International. Freek just mentioned migration and migration patterns, and part of that, we've got climate change to think about and conflict. And I know that the work that you do kind of touches upon some of those areas. Maybe you can just give us a bit of an overview.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me this afternoon. It's been a really great day so far. I guess I'll start with Ukraine. I was going to maybe talk a bit about our work in Ukraine, but I'll save that because lots of you will know DePaul UK, but we operate in seven countries, and since the full-scale invasion, DePaul Ukraine, which has been operational since 2007, has scaled up massively. It's run a £25 million humanitarian response. With working largely with displaced people and people who have become rough sleepers because of the war. But what we're looking at now at DePaul International, really, to speak to Vera's point, is all of the Ukrainian refugees in Europe. There's 6.3 million Ukrainian refugees in Europe, and yes, the Temporary Protection Directive has been extended, but support is already reducing. And the war will end, that directive will end. And yes, a big part of that population will be able to safely return home or will be able to apply for visas under different routes. Some of them won't. Some of them are at risk of homelessness. And we need to be planning for that now as a sector. Touched on climate change. Obviously, DePaul works mostly in Northern European and Eastern European countries, and I sit here as a Londoner, so I'm sure there are others in the room that can speak who are living climate change and the effects of climate change day to day. But we are beginning to see it, and it's becoming an issue of increasing importance for us. We have DePaul USA. So we're seeing the effects of climate change have a direct impact on health of our clients. We're seeing climate disasters disproportionately affect people from low-income families, causing displacement in southern USA. And we're also we're just about to launch actually a very, very small pilot transitional housing program in the Philippines. I mean, there's 3 million internally displaced people in the Philippines due to typhoons. And this is a tiny project that's going to help 30 families, but it's a start. So DePaul USA, our partner in the Philippines, we're kind of living and breathing climate change already. But it strikes me that it feels quite absent from a lot of conversations in the sector. Obviously, it's been touched on a bit today, but we could have a whole conference on it, right? And we likely will, because climate change is happening. It's not something that's coming in the future. Temperatures have already risen, and it's going to have a huge impact. It's already climate-related disasters and climate-related migration and displacement, which is different, obviously, already kind of causing millions of people to move, and that's only going to increase. There's one study which predicts that over 1 billion people could be climate refugees by 2050. That's within my career, that's soon. So we need to be talking about it, we need to be pragmatic, and we need to plan. We need to kind of adopt some futures thinking and really look to the future and create some strategies that will prepare us for that.
Brilliant, thank you. That actually gives me a very nice, neat segue into my next question. Robert Lewis-Lettington, you are the Senior Advisor for Land, Housing and Human Rights at UN Habitat. And I was looking at your strategic plan and looking at what your UN Habitat is saying about moving from vision to action. And I mean, thinking about all the challenges, there's political turmoil that's been mentioned, we've got climate change, migration issues, a conflict. How are you negotiating that crazy backdrop and actually moving from vision to action? Where do you even begin with that?
Yeah, I think, well, thank you. And thank you very much to World Habitat as well for being here and giving me the invitation. It's always a pleasure to take part in discussions like this. I think the first point I would say is I would cheat slightly and say we're not, all of you are. Our job isn't primarily to do things, it's to help other people do things. We do, as UN Habitat, and I guess as the UN in general, quite often have to get involved in doing things, usually when it's not easy for other people to do it. But as much as possible, I think our role needs to be facilitating others. The big concern for us, particularly in the world as it is now, a lot of the development work of the UN, when you go back to the 1940s and 50s, started with the idea that newly independent countries shouldn't be dependent upon the developed world, their former colonial masters, whoever you want to point to, for advice and support and funding. They should be able to make their own decisions. So our job is to try and sort of channel that in a way. Habitat, I don't know how many of you know us, but we're a very small agency by UN standards. We, depending on how you count it, anywhere between about 150 and 300 staff globally, and very small budgets compared to a lot of the other agencies. But that means, in a way, we're dependent upon partners in that sense as well, because we don't have the footprint, we don't have the resources and the staffing. But that is where, for example, things like today come up. The examples, not just this year's winners, and I want to stress, not just the winners, the runners-up. I think I was putting this in a note the other day for something, just kind of getting on the radar of the World Habitat Awards is pretty good going, really. That means you've got to be doing something useful. So putting that out there and giving us the ability to share that with other people is hugely useful. I think constantly reminding those who are sitting in power, I think people often forget, as the UN, we're not in charge. We're just the secretariat who do what we're told by the powers that be. Fine, we may have some influence. But we need to rely on reminding member states and their representatives that people care about this stuff. I've sat in a number of meetings where people have said, for example, on homelessness, well, look at the numbers it affects globally. It's too small. It doesn't matter. It's not a priority issue. And you're like, well, try telling that to somebody who's in the situation. But also, show me a society that does well on homelessness in its policy terms. And I stress, I think, picking up on Freek's point, in policy terms, because in the exact numbers, there can be a funny game there. But are you trying to do something good? Are you trying to move forward? A country that's doing well on that is probably doing well on most of the other things we care about as well. It's a very key indicator type social issue, I think. And also, as people mentioned this morning, it plugs straight into housing systems. If your housing system is messed up, you probably have a pretty big problem with homelessness as well. and so on and so forth. Again, links into crime and drugs and to other things, not in the way of stigmatizing people, but if you don't take care of housing, you will probably create more problems with all of these other things. So I think all of that matters. We need to work with all of you. But as the UN, and I promise I will wrap it up here thinking I need to be concise, we are not easy to work with. We're a bureaucracy. We're very politically driven. It's hard. So that means that working with us isn't always working through us and doing things that we ask you to do. Sometimes it's saying, can you please go and shout about what we're not doing well, but just don't tell them I told you to. Because then that puts the pressure on member states to say, why aren't you doing anything? Why is it we're just preparing, right yesterday on the plane over, I was reviewing the latest draft of the Secretary General's report on homelessness. Because of UN austerity, there is no funding for doing that this year, none. The other UN agency that partners with us on it has just said, we can't do anything because there's no funding, so we're just not contributing, you're on your own. My colleague, who is the lead pen holder on that, doesn't have support, doesn't have money. She's doing it because she believes in it and is pushing it. That needs everybody else to be out there saying, why are you guys doing it like this? You should be doing it better. You should be following up on it more. It shouldn't just be a report. There should be a program that follows. There should be other things that go with it. And so we need constituencies like that to push for this. And related to that, really my very last point, we did a study for the first UN forum on housing that met last December, looking at development financing. No bilateral donor anywhere that we could find has housing as a priority. None. The only two that kind of had significant programs came from the Gulf. I think one was from the UAE, one was from Saudi. Very specific support to bilateral partners they have. Housing just isn't on the development finance agenda, and it should be. Some of the banks are doing better. You can argue about the quality of the programs, but they're doing something. But the bilateral donors, the government, the political support needs to increase. And we need to encourage the political actors to look outwards. We've had some engagement with the UK Foreign Office, and they're saying there is a much higher priority on housing in the UK recently, but it's very inward focused, and the housing department doesn't have any sense of multilateral engagement. I understand that, I appreciate it, their priority is their constituency, but we need them to also help push outwards and help get things moving with other countries too.
Super, thank you. And Louise Winterburn, Deputy CEO of World Habitat. And one of the things that I love working with World Habitat for is all of these really amazing stories, all of the case studies you've got about what works. How do we take all of that insight and that knowledge that you've got and work more effectively together so that we can build and strengthen supply and create the change that we want?
Yeah. Well, I got the lovely part. Did you see that in terms of actually the challenges the people are working so hard to make that change? But, I mean, the story of the World Habitat Awards over 40 years is struggle. It's the story that Vera has been telling us of actually seeing the problem and actually struggling through and finding solutions year in, year out. I mean, I'm hoping that if you haven't already, you will go and have a look at our database of 40 years worth of those solutions. But behind each one is that story of struggle and difficulty. But also, importantly, what is behind it, and I've got some notes because I really don't want to get this wrong when you're talking about other people's great work, is actually about opportunities like today and those conversations you were having at lunch and at break and spotting names and working together. Because actually what we find is the ripple effect of meeting Vera, of meeting other people here today, is actually people taking that away and adapting it and making it work in their own community. So actually part of it is about today. And one of the things that I wanted to kind of pull out is, community land trusts. We're going to hear a little bit more, so I feel like I'm setting this up for Jess in a moment. But it is one of those stories of how do you make a difference. I think think is really important. Some of you will be aware community land trusts are a way of owning land and buildings within the community in perpetuity. Is an incredibly strong, fantastic model used by many award winners, but it originally grew out of the civil rights movement in America. You know, that human rights that we've talked about. Housing was so important, so central, that they actually came up with a model to make sure that they could provide that housing. Now, if you watch that story, and I like to think that the award at different times has been around for some of this important story, to see the ripples of those people that made that model and talked about it and shared their ideas. In 2018, we awarded Champlain Housing Trust in the USA for their amazing work, an amazing, still a really amazing and very important early pioneer of community land trusts. 3,000 properties they have now. In 2009, they hosted a visit, so World Habitat Awards took out 24 participants from 14 countries. Now that's where it gets interesting. You start finding out what they did next. What happens when you take people who've seen that problem in their own community and have the energy and vision and have a model to work with? And what happened next, and I was desperately trying to look, but the lights are not helping me. One of those people, only one of those out of those 24 I'm going to mention, is Gert from Brussels. He came back, there we go. Thank you. Who went up and helped set up the first community land trust in Brussels, and since then has been an inspiration to many across Europe, was one of the driving forces, amongst many, we never do these things alone, who launched the European CLT network 2 years ago. Those ripples keep going in terms of people providing that very practical support and inspiration and making these things happen. At the same time as I'm talking about that, I can take us to Puerto Rico, where a local community also looked at CLTs 20 years ago, where they were part of the Martin Pena Channel, a waterway that runs right through the capital, home to 5,000 informal homes, great deal of flooding, lots of problems and social issues, and informal settlement. They looked at the CLT model and were able to hundreds of meetings with the municipality later who wanted to drain it, but this would then become a very valuable piece of land. And you can imagine if you're one of those homes living in that informal settlement, what that means if you live in a capital on a very expensive piece of real estate that now can be used. Hundreds of meetings later, and they agree a CLT. So that collectively own 200 acres of land. Good quality land that they're building homes on, building lives on. And that is a sense of the struggle of using community land trusts. Now, they have personally been an inspiration in other informal settlements. So for the last few years, one of my colleagues, Yorgos over there, has been working in 2 other informal settlements, one in Brazil, one in Bangladesh, where exactly the same thing is happening. We're looking at whether we can use that same model to collectively own that land, give security, and build homes and communities. So for me, that's where the change comes. You know, people pioneering these approaches and generosity, you know, giving their time, and people coming and taking those solutions and adapting them and then sharing them again. So I do believe that is the action that you are talking about. The awards is one of the ways that we've shown that, you know, we can put a spotlight on some of that actions, but actually it's the people here who've done that, who've generously given their time and energy. So to me, that's where the action comes in against all of the challenges, because the awards have always been about how people have responded to challenge.
Brilliant, thank you. Let's open it up to the people here and get some questions. Can I get a show of hands, please? Don't be shy, I know it's the afternoon. Any questions at all? I'm going to let you think about it for a minute, and I'm going to come back to the panel with one of my own. And that is around, how do we join up the dots? We've spoken a lot about housing and homelessness and affordability, but Kwadwo this morning spoke about the impact on health and education. How do we make sure that we're getting the right people in the room and all having conversations and working together across different departments, different countries, different sectors? Who shall I pick on for that? Mark, I'm going to go with you first.
I mean, that is the question. That is what needs to be done if we're going to kind of really turn the tide, I suppose, on homelessness, global homelessness. But But I think it will need to be looked at different levels. This is a great start, or like places like this where it's largely, I think, the third sector in the room. So this is kind of one networking space, and there are other things that are similar. Government departments is the challenge, and to be honest, I'm not sure how we address that especially in the climate where we're in at the moment. And then I think we should look as a sector at some of the international forums. So we've been thinking about COP recently, really with like a climate lens, but housing and homelessness has bin kind of absent from conversations at that level. And so I think we need to come together as a sector, as sectors, to like, what's our message? How do we get our cause and the people that we're here to support into conversations like that?
Yeah.
Haven't really answered your question.
Well, Freek, I'm going to come to you, because working in the EU, negotiating all of those different countries and priorities, maybe you've got some insights to share.
What I learned is that homelessness is a distinct issue in need of a distinct policy approach. It's connected to many other things, but when homelessness is not explicitly mentioned in policy, it just gets forgotten. That's at least true at European level. And I think you have to be annoying to constantly repeat that homelessness is the issue, and you shouldn't forget homeless. Like that's, sometimes I feel I have been repeating that for 25 years. Some progress has been made, but probably not sufficient. But it is a distinct issue in need of a distinct strategy. That's very important. And the other thing I learned is that if you want to get the different partners around the table, you shouldn't make too much fuss and noise about it. We have to be modest, like certainly as international organizations, about the claim of impact, you know. I sometimes have the impression if we as FEANTSA claim impact, we jeopardize the impact of the future, because people they want to claim the impact themselves, and that's fine, you know. So I think we have to be a little bit modest in what we do. I appreciate your enthusiasm, etc. But sometimes I think like let's be a bit modest about that. Interesting, in Finland, for instance, we always cite Finland a model, and Finland has done great, and Finland has done great. But people in Finland are not aware about how great they are. And I think it's actually part of the success. Well, we tell them constantly, but they don't make fuss about it. They just do the work, and it allows a little bit of failure. Like if you look at the numbers in Finland over the last 20 years, they didn't go down consistently. It plateaued a few times, it went up a few times and down again. But if it's not constantly in the media and spoken about, you can overcome that. You know, like there is a safe space where you can talk with your partners. And I think we have to create that. Probably it's depending on the culture and policy making in different countries, I know that. But in general terms, being a little bit less loud about the impact we generate, I think it might help to create impact.
Louise, are you going to disagree with that?
Never been not loud in my life. I suppose I would say one of the things that I would look to when you ask that question, and you know, yes, very much in terms of having been a policy person in 10 years ago, is actually obviously where I see the strength and the change is often at community level, at neighbourhood level. You know, whether, I mean, I bring cake. I'm going to have to say it's less loud, but there is definitely cake. But actually bringing together the people who can make that change on a local level. I mean, then hopefully bringing it up and bringing the policy change because of the evidence-based approach to it. But for me, that's where the power to change and change quickly actually can happen.
Yeah. Right, you've had plenty of time to think of questions. I want to see some hands in the air. Excellent. Is that Rick I see in the middle? Excellent. If I pass the microphone along to him, please. And is there anybody else? All right, we'll start with Rick and see where.
Thanks very much. You talked, a few of you talked about the kind of shift towards kind of populist government, sort of euphemism for a shift to kind of essentially quasi-far right kind of politics. And now if that shift towards the right across Europe continues, that then challenges us to think of a way of presenting the narrative or the cause of homelessness maybe in a different way. So I wonder if there's any kind of examples people have got of whether or not there is a way of kind of presenting the homelessness issue as something that that can be allowed to play in a progressive way, even with some of these kind of oppressive government regimes. Because if we can't do that, we're just going to spend the next decade fighting, aren't we?
Yeah. Vera, I'm going to come to you for that question.
Yeah. Well, I think I am personally might not be the best framing it differently, but I know that there is a different framework, and that's the economical one. So it's just really worth it to house people instead of offering all the crisis and emergency services all the time. And even we ourselves did research in Hungary showing that if we do the expenditure on like police interactions, ambulance interactions, crisis shelters, and all the emergency interventions that it takes a person to be a rough sleeper, it's way more expensive than that just to solve the problem. And there was a, but when it comes to Hungary, it's not that we are there yet, that we need a different framing. We need to break that ice yet. So I think this debate is really not for us, but I think they did similar like cost effectiveness calculations in Canada, in the US, and in many Western countries, and especially when doing evaluation of bringing housing first methods from Finland to Belgium. I think you must have done this. So.
Yeah. The problem is that the cost-benefit argument in the practice often doesn't work, and certainly in populist countries. That's often the challenge. It works over time, because I think the homeless shelter sector will inevitably professionalize and specialize, etc., and it will become more expensive. And over time, it will be more expensive than the alternative. But it's very difficult to make that argument with politicians that are in power now.
But I think at least that it is true for most of Western Europe, but it is a slippery slope because, for example, then I might see in Hungary that the answer for that may come that they cut even the existing very poor services for that argument. So then it won't take their money. So I would be very cautious with that negotiating.
Yeah. Maybe to add to it, I think I'm thinking aloud. Maybe I'm totally wrong. But I think one of the complications to get political buy-in, certainly with growing populism, etc., is that we combine in homeless strategies the prevention element and the actual rehousing element. And sometimes I wonder if it's not better to split those into different strategies. It allows, for instance, to more effectively deal with the migration issue, for instance. Now it's constantly popping up and it's unhelpful, and it's sometimes artificially pushed through to make things more complicated, but then don't necessarily have to be so complicated. So sometimes I think having prevention strategy and having a rehousing strategy as two different strategies with two different ministers responsible might be a way forward, but it's a daring thought, maybe totally wrong.
Robert, I wonder if I can ask you a question, and that's around the financing models, if you're able to. We've spoken earlier on today about the spending review from the UK government and what that's intending to do, and we've also spoken about the impact of funding cuts. Where's the money coming from for this work, and what are the kind of financial models that might be helpful?
I wish I knew where the money was coming from. Then I might go and chase some of it. I think, it depends a lot on which country you're talking about. I think in some countries, there is a decent amount of funding for certain sectors. I think some of the European multilateral banks are quite enlightened in how they approach some of these things compared to the global average, and are thinking harder than the average about where they're putting their money and what they hope to achieve with it. Government policy, I always get a bit nervous. I was thinking when seeing that announcement yesterday for the UK, thinking, okay, 39 billion, that's great. but what does it mean? I remember there was I can't remember how many years ago, but a similar situation where in the UK the Chancellor announced 20 billion for funding. And then it turned out that 18 billion of that went to 5 companies. And you just go, okay, well, that was great. And it didn't really fix anything at the end of the day. I mean, it obviously fixed a very comfortable life for a few people, but mostly in the shareholder side. But so where we put the money becomes as important as where it's coming from and how much. I think we've also got to avoid the situations where we're taking money from the wrong places sometimes and not looking. I mean, a lot of the cities that we work in developing countries, the tax on land and property in urban areas is either missing or is very, very low. And most of the people who own that property are definitely in the few percent at the top. You have to tax that properly, and you have to use that for urban growth. It should take care of homelessness and social housing and other things, but amongst others. So there is wealth out there, and you don't have to be punitive about how you bring the money through. I don't think development financing is ever going to be a solution, because I think that is always just going to do enough to kind of catalyze and do a little bit again about what the awards are doing, of showing some examples and allowing those to happen and say this is possible. But you need to mainstream, and I think for us that means that particularly property tax, I think, is something we need to keep pushing on. I know it's always a little bit controversial, but looking at land taxation is always of strong interest because of that also corresponding ability to flatten out speculation. I think there's still obviously a long way to go on that because it's politically difficult. But I also think what I heard in the breakout session I was in, and also I think is the case when I heard the awardees talking amongst each other about how many people they've got on their list of donors. And I mean, I'm not even close to that in our world, and it frustrates me. But that really does highlight, I think that comes through a lot, that the nimbleness and the agility that requires and the constant looking. It's hard work, but I think that is good because that's how you put together a package, but it also makes you an awful lot more resilient, so you don't get a USAID or whatever. If you lose one, it doesn't kill you off completely, and it gives you still some ability to move and adapt to circumstances. But at the core, I think that why I keep coming back to public money and property taxation in particular, but some other areas, is how, in our experience, housing systems overall, and I would dare to say I think this applies for good homelessness policy as well, it's got to be long-term and it's got to be consistent. You can't do it for 2 or 3 years and then walk away saying, I want to do something else now. You've got to do it for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And then it becomes cheaper and more affordable because you're slowly accumulating and building up a solid foundation that will last. And that can only really come through public and communal systems. Community land trust is great in a way because it kind of fills that gap where the public isn't going to function, isn't going to do it, and it gives you another way of achieving those characteristics.
Did you want to come in, Freek? No? Louise, was there anything that you wanted to add to that? No? Okay, so questions, right, excellent. We've got a gentleman just here and then the gentleman behind.
It was enough.
We'll take both questions at the same time. If you can introduce yourself, please.
Okay, Geoffrey Payne. I've worked on housing issues for a long time. First of all, I'd like to congratulate World Habitat for organising this event. I think it's been a great opportunity to see some of the positive things that are being done to address the housing issue. At the same time, I have been to several conferences over a long time, and it has become clear today in many of the presentations that we are facing a global crisis. And since housing is a reflection of those societies that create it, and if we accept that the housing sector is broken, does that not suggest that society is broken? And as Leilani said in her excellent presentation, the human rights aspect, making a home, is different to just providing housing. And I think that us as a community have a responsibility not just to analyze the problems and come up with individual solutions, but to maybe try and work towards a plan B. You know, if housing is part of the problem, it can be part of the solution. And I think if we can individually, collectively, try to identify the key issues that need to be addressed and how we can get public support, which is the key thing, for fundamental change in the way we live. And I really pick up on the point of Finland and Denmark and Austria. You know, these are countries which don't regard housing primarily as a speculative investment, as a commodity. They have a different approach and their societies are structured in different ways. How can we, and this is my concern, how can we generate support for changing the way we live in a socially and environmentally sustainable way? I'd be very interested in your thoughts.
Excellent, thank you. Another big question, and then the gentleman behind, please.
Hi, I'm Shamir Dawood. I'm from Helium Capital, and I have a very similar question to Jeffrey. You know, we spoke a lot about refugees, migration, movement, and building off Leilani's earlier phrase from the Declaration of Human Rights, we are a human family. And the politicians take impetus and impulse from people's desire for change. And behavior change is difficult, I appreciate that. So apologies, Mark. I said I wasn't going to ask any hard questions, but I'm kind of giving you a hard one. How do we change people's perspective on the value of people? People affected by homelessness, refugees, asylum seekers, they all have something to offer. In 1776, a group of refugees and asylum seekers traveled across the ocean to create what became an economic superpower. Now, it's changed a bit to date, but there's no reason that we can't find value in people. So how do we persuade the electorate that that is where the value is?
Yeah, okay, so, and I'm going to use my chair's prerogative to add a slight other question to this as well, and that's, have you got any provocations for everybody in the audience? We're running out of time, so I'm going to go along the line. So you can answer the questions posed by the audience, and then also maybe you might have a challenge also for them about what they're going to do next. So, Freek, I'm going to start with you.
Yes, I think in my job I have become really pragmatic and opportunistic. And have shone away from the sort of big ideas and big changes. Lately I was actually reprimanded by our board member from the UK, Matt Downey, to say you have to think more big, don't get too pragmatic in your life. But if you allow me to be pragmatic, like sometimes you can change things in England or in the UK without changing the whole world. Huh? From a European perspective, and again, it's with a lot of modesty that I say it, but if your standard tenancy is 6 months or 1 year, there's something wrong. Like, no serious country has such terrible tenancy protection. Another example, writing the concept of intentional homelessness in law is ridiculous. I don't know any country that does that. So get rid of that. Like, I'm a strong believer in European cooperation and European comparison. Like, there is some examples where you can single out England and say, well, that's really not good. And probably that's helpful to get some of the bigger changes going, you know? So I have a tendency to be pragmatic and look for these kind of practical hooks. Maybe that was sufficient as a provocation as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Louise?
I suppose I would say I work for an organisation that celebrates solutions, pragmatic solutions, inspiring solutions, big things, big ambitions for where people live and what they want. And I see every day roomfuls of people that are kind of making it happen. So I think society is broken. I guess if we look at the bigger picture, maybe, but actually in communities, I see people actually making that change happen every day. So for me, my provocation would be take away from today some inspiration, some numbers, and talk to us about the things that you're actually doing.
Excellent, thank you. Vera?
Okay, so when answering the question, it's not that I'm going to do that, but I think the solution is around like communities. So idea always been to take out the commodities you need for life from being a commodity and having them as provided as human rights. And it sounds so basic, but when it comes to growing food for your community, when it comes to building home for your community, then that should be easy, and it's so hard. So I think my provocation is that what the capitalist system has to do with all this, basically.
Thank you.
I guess I've got two thoughts. One is very much from like a homelessness perspective. I sometimes, and this is just my personal thought, but I sometimes wonder how helpful framing the issue as homelessness actually is compared to other sectors. I mean, it's a silly comparison, but we don't talk about schoollessness, right? We talk about education. So maybe kind of reframing and talking about housing as the homelessness sector and what that means for other parts of for the economy, for community. Maybe that kind of helps with kind of some of the reframing. And the second, in answer to your question, is the power of lived experience and ensuring that that is central to our conferences, to the leadership of our organizations, so that kind of decision-making and where power at the moment is hearing experience, ideas, solutions that come from those who've been affected. My provocation, I don't think society's broken. We're in a difficult time, but I guess following on from Louise's point, who are you going to talk to after today? Who are you going to reach out to? What new connection, what new work can come out of today?
Excellent, thank you. And last but by no means least, Robert.
I think on the questions, you know, I don't want to attempt to answer the is it broken bit, but I think broken, frayed, under pressure, whatever you want to call it, we got some problems, and those are all over the place. I think one of the things I want to push on is in some particular places, yes, there is a crisis, but I don't, and maybe this is part of my provocation, I don't buy the idea that we've got a global crisis, because you don't have a crisis if you designed it to be that way. This is a systemic outcome of something that we've done intentionally in lots and lots of places. It may be a combination of decisions. There isn't a great evil genius above saying, I'm going to screw everything up on housing and homelessness. But, you know, the system produces the results that you would expect it to. So we need to look at it at that sense and recognize that this is something we've been doing over time, which also means we have the agency and the power to fix it. And I think that's one of the most attractive things that comes back to the point earlier about how do you deal with some of the populism issues. They like wins, particularly very high-profile, visible wins. Homelessness and even some of the aspects of the housing system are pretty fixable. And you can get a lot of great PR out of saying, I did this. I mean, COVID, we made massive strides. Okay, temporary fixes and shortcomings in places, but we changed a lot almost overnight. We can do that, even in very, very poor places. So I think there's hope there.
Okay.
The other provocation I just want to flag as the last one is which is very much coming from a selfish point of view as a UN bureaucrat, and even worse, a UN bureaucratic lawyer. Still have some faith in the multilateral system. One of the things I take from Leilani's point, human rights is a non-negotiable thing. And the multilateral system is a way of putting pressure and shining a light on that and keeping it going. Yes, it's rubbish and it's massively frustrating. I can see it, and I know Leilani's had a lot more of that personally than I have, but that can be pushed on. And use things like, we fought for years to get this new forum on housing. It's not good, it's rough and ready, the process is bad. It will only get better if people lean into it and support it and say, I demand that it be better. I demand it give us what we need. So lean into that, push it, take ownership, and make it what you want it to be.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, that gives us a nice note to end on. So it might be broken, but we can all fix it. And having had conversations with you in the room, I am absolutely confident that that is the case. And indeed, we have the awards coming up next, where we're going to celebrate more of those great results. But for now, can you please put your hands together and thank Robert, Mark, Vera, Louise, and Freek. Thank you very much.